the Paul, we're good to go.
We're live on YouTube.
Thank you. So there's poorly printed agendas at the end of the table if you'd like one. And if you wouldn't mind passing around that sign-in sheet if you haven't signed in yet. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. It's always fun to see this room completely full. So in case you don't know me, I'm Marisa Weinberg. I'm the interim Great Salt Lake coordinator with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. So welcome to our second tech team meeting of 2023. I'm excited you're all here. And so I'll go ahead and just dive right into it. Give you guys some updates from our various Great Salt Lake bodies. So the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council will be meeting again tomorrow, May 10th at the Eccles Wildlife Center in Farmington. If you're able to attend in person, should be a really great meeting. We'll be hearing from Ben Hudson on a water optimization program update, and I'll be speaking about my master's project on Fremont Island. So if you're interested in that, or if you can tune in virtually, we'd love to see you there. And then I'll pass it over to Ben for a Salinity Advisory Committee update.
Morning. Thanks, Marissa. So you all know that we raised the berm to 4192, I think. So that was done. Yeah. Maybe heard about it. It's been kind of a popular topic, but the berm was raised, and as part of the governor's executive order, we had to come up with a plan for the future management of the berm. And so as a committee, we met, the Salinity Committee met last month, and we were able to come to a unanimous decision for an interim protocol, we're calling it, which will manage through April this way, and then in April we'll try to have a more robust plan in place. But basically what it boils down to is we'll have it at 4192, and at the end of the runoff season we will evaluate the head difference between the north and south, and if there is a difference in headspace, we will make a calculated decision on how much water to export to the north arm. So hopefully by doing that, we'll know exactly how much salt we're sending to the north. This year, since we had such a good winter back in January when we were going to 4192, I don't think anybody thought that we'd be spilling over into the north arm already. But this year, I don't know that there will be a head difference. It might just level out, and the berm will just be kind of a speed bump for any water going north or south or vice versa. So we'll have to evaluate that come the end of runoff. But for now, we are planning on being ready to modify that again. We did receive funding from the legislature to continue to modify that, but that's the big news with the Salinity Committee. We're meeting again next week, I think. Yeah. Yep. So if you would like to tune into that, you're all welcome. That's it.
Thanks, Ben. And yeah, if any of you are not on a listserv that you want to be on to receive meeting notifications for all three of our Great Salt Lake bodies, feel free to let me know or mark it on the sign-in sheet. I'm happy to make that happen. So lastly, what I'm sure you're all anxious to hear about, our tech team grants update. So we were really excited to receive 15 proposals this round for Great Salt Lake tech team grants. And we're actually meeting today to discuss those and rank and hopefully notify folks who submitted proposals of awards this week or early next week. So more to come on that, and sorry you don't have more exciting updates today. And thank you to subcommittee members in the room who traveled far to spend literally all day at our office. So looking forward to that. And so without further ado, we'll jump right into our presentations. We have lovely Christine here from USGS to talk first on salt cycling in a terminal lake. So I'm going to present this, and then I'll just open drive. All right, everyone.
Any particular terminal lake you're going to talk
Severe. The terminal. Okay, cool. Great. Thanks, Marissa. If we can get a laser, or just in case. Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having us here today. Myself, along with our team at USGS, we're happy to share our work on kind of looking at salt cycling and salt mass quantification in the south arm of Great Salt Lake. So myself, Scott Henick, Hannah, Ryan, Mike Freeman in our shop. And then along the way, the project has kind of grown. It started off as a Forestry Fried Lands Hot Topics grant, and to kind of meet the needs of the Salinity Advisory Committee and kind of meet the moment as we were experiencing very high salinities in 2021 and 2022, it sort of grew. So we joined up with collaborators from UGS, from Utah State, Division of Water Resources, and also Branch of Cooperative. So I'll try to breeze through this. It's kind of a lot of information, but bear with me. So I know Great Salt Lake does not need introduction, but we just wanted to kind of mention that the salinity and the current state that we're in is really a legacy of a much broader, longer history of Lake Bonneville and the concentration of solutes over hundreds, thousands of years to get us where we are today. So climatic and landscape processes make Great Salt Lake what it is. And that there's also a significant characteristic to consider when we think about salt cycling in the lake, which is the rock-filled railroad causeway that bisects the lake between through the middle into a north and a south arm. And I know you're all familiar with this. Where freshwater inflows flow into the south, restricted mixing across the causeway results in a salinity gradient between the north and south arms that has been documented, and has been documented to kind of deviate from a theoretical undivided lake of we're kind of between this north and south gradient that would not previously exist. So very important to consider the causeway anytime we think about salt. And not only does the causeway exist, it's existed since 1959, but it's also undergone a number of different modifications through time. So at the lake high stand in the 80s, the lakeside breach was constructed in 1984. That's kind of off the map here. Here we're just showing off the plot, lake surface elevation from 1985 to present. So lakeside breach constructed in 84, modified subsequently in 96, 98, and then in 2000 again. And each time that there's kind of been these modifications, there have been researchers who have tried to study the flow and how that's flow through the causeway and how that's affected salt mixing through the lake. Each of these modifications have mattered, their width, their depth. And so the period that we're kind of tackling in this present study is from 2010 to present. And during this period, there have been a number of different management paradigms where we've had the lakeside breach open along with two culverts, what we call the east and west culverts. Those were closed in about 2014. And then so we had this period of basically culvert closure where there was no real mixing allowed through the causeway except through lakeside, which has limited mixing. You can see how the north and south arms diverged during this period. And then subsequently, a new breach was opened in December of 2016 that kind of introduced a new management paradigm that we were all trying to understand and how that affected salt cycling. And so our current study covers this period, 3 different management paradigms of culverts being open, culverts closed, and then we affectionately call the new breach west crack. And so that's how I'll have to refer to it throughout this presentation. And the period that we ended in July 28th, 2022, that's when the berm was modified at West Crack to raise it and try to restrict north to south flow. So to give you a sense of the period of study that we are covering here. And our main objectives were to kind of wrap our brain around all the salinity data that exist to verify the equation of state. This is our method we use to estimate salinity in the south arm that has been adopted by others also. But what I'll primarily be focusing on are these last 3 objectives, which are quantifying the salt mass in the upper and deep layers of the south arm. I know we all kind of refer to that deep layer as the deep brine layer. Here we've kind of broadened that a little bit to say we're going to look at the layer below the chemocline. There are stratifications that happen in the south arm that are not strictly the deep brine layer. So throughout this, I'll kind of be referring to the chemocline or the layer below the chemocline, which is that stratification in the water column. We're going to try to understand salt mass fluctuations that we've observed over time. There have been notable trajectories, and so we try to wrap our brain around why those are happening. And then we do that primarily by looking at the salt mass that's coming in from rivers, as well as that salt mass exchange that's happening at the causeway. And all of these analyses rely on monitoring programs that are ongoing. So USGS partners with numerous state agencies to monitor nutrients, trace metals, and salinities. And so we've kind of rounded together 6 independent salinity data sets to estimate salt mass in the South Arm. These include the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program. These data are collected at 4 sites, shown by these yellow diamonds in the South Arm. This is really what we consider the gold standard data set. And so thanks to our friends at GSLEP, they collect these samples and they're integral to this monitoring program. So this is a really temporally dense data set from about 2010 to present. Data are collected monthly again. We also have a collaboration with the Division of Water Quality, where we collect open water sites at 7 locations twice per year, in June and October. Those are shown in the kind of orange squares here to give you an idea. And then a number of kind of other discrete sites where we have data include the Saltair Gauge. This is where our water surface elevation is. We collect salinity there. We collect salinity at West Crack, that new opening in the causeway, the new breach. At Lakeside Breach, when it's flowing, it's been dry for the last couple of years, but we do have a historic data set there. And then we also worked with Andrew and Elliot at UGS to bring in their data. They also have a monitoring program in the South Arm where they collect data 1 to 3 times per year. So we wanted to just throw everything we could at this and see if they're all telling the same thing, and also to assess the robustness and of our analytical approach. So we'll start with kind of just a quantification of salt mass. And here I'm showing mean monthly dissolved salt in millions of tons from June of 2010 to July of 2022. The different colors denote the South Arm salt mass, that's in blue, and the North Arm salt mass in red. And that was provided by UGS. So they're really the experts in that arm of the lake, but we wanted to provide a full picture of salt for the Great Salt Lake. And what's notable here is that we do see fluctuations in South Arm salt mass. For example, in 2011, we had a really big runoff year where we saw a decline in South Arm salt mass, presumably as, and this gray line is kind of water surface elevation between north and south. So as we saw a gain in the South Arm, that it corresponds with an export of salt out of the South Arm and into the North Arm. You can kind of see an uptick there. So responding to hydroclimatic conditions, salt masses. Also, we see a really steep decline in salt mass, another kind of export event happening after West Crack was opened in December of 2016, where we lost an estimated 160 million tons of salt during that event. And then really interestingly, and I think this really captured the attention of the Salinity Advisory Committee when Phil Brown shared this basically a couple of years ago, is that the South Arm salt mass has been gradually increasing since about the fall of 2017. And so we really kind of want to understand what is driving that. Presumably it's kind of this return flow from the north, but we wanted to quantify that. And so part of what I'll be sharing is our attempt to do that. Digging into a little bit more of the South Arm salt dynamics. Here's mean monthly dissolved salt mass. So where is salt in the South Arm? It's primarily in the upper brine layers. It has the greatest amount of volume, so a lot of salt is held there. But we also see as much as 22% of salt being held below this deep layer below the chemocline, both in Carrington and in Gilbert Bay. And it really, basically any time where we have kind of open connection along the causeway where the culverts are open or where West Crack is open, we observe this more hypersaline layer below the chemocline.
Christine, it's a little, I want to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the deep brine layer represented there exactly?
Here.
Which trees?
These red and orange lines.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yep. Carrington Bay deep layer is in red and orange is the Gilbert Bay deep layer. And this dashed line represents kind of the percent of mass below the chemocline. That's kind of the secondary y-axis here. So lots of fluctuation through time, but consistently see that it exists when there's openings in the causeway besides Lakeside. Again, Lakeside is not a huge site where we observe mixing between the two arms. And most recently, we saw a decline in this layer below the chemocline of salt below that layer and starting in about 2021. And we hypothesize that this is due to lake level, where you kind of get this wind energy across the lake and it's able to penetrate deeper as lake levels go down and kind of mix out that deep layer. So trying to just better understand the stratification through time and being able to do that with our monitoring data we collect. And as I mentioned, we kind of threw everything but the kitchen sink at this, all these different data sets, and we were able to quantify the upper brine layer salt, and basically to just
figure out if can we substitute these different data sets? Are they comparable? And we were really encouraged to see that if we, again, consider the GSLEP monthly data set as our gold standard, that when we compare all of these other data sets, we get salt masses within about 8% of GSLEP about 95% of the time. And so this means that, say we weren't able to go out on the South Arm and get a sample, we can likely substitute salinity data from Solitaire Marina, or we can substitute data collected at West Crack, which are more easily accessible, to just estimate what the South Arm salt mass and upper brine layer is. So we were pretty encouraged to see this. Also encouraged to see that the GSLEP, which is again a 4-site network, compared well with the 7-site network we have, giving us confidence that these 4 sites are representative of salinity conditions in the South Arm. So this kind of really just informs our monitoring programs moving forward, gives us confidence that we're collecting data that are comparable and representative of South Arm salinities. All right. So this is kind of getting into the meat of what we wanted to try and explain. So if we revisit this dissolved salt mass time series, revisiting this idea that we've seen this increase in salt mass trajectory since about 2017 when West Crack opened, we wanted to try and understand what has been driving that. So we consider salt fluxes coming into the lake via river inflows, kind of shown by these blue arrows, as well as flow from north to south at West Crack. And then we also needed to consider how much salt is leaving the South Arm into the north via the West Crack north to south flow, as well as through lakeside. And Flux is just computed using a simple kind of discharge times concentration computation. So starting off, this was kind of our first attempt at this. So looking at quantifying a daily salt flux in millions of tons per day. So at a given site, how much mass is moving across that site for a given day. And this is a plot showing a time series for south to north flow shown in blue at West Crack, for north to south flow shown in red at West Crack, at Lakeside, that Lakeside opening on the west side of the causeway, and then river inflows are shown in blue. So right off the bat, if we compare these magnitudes, we can see that the greatest amount of salt mass transfer is happening at West Crack, both from south to north and north to south. Lakeside has a decent amount of transfer happening from south to north, but really a lot of action happening at West Crack, especially when we compare that to the river inflows. But in our preliminary, and then I also want to highlight the kind of temporal dynamics of this. So on the secondary y-axis is the South Arm lake elevation shown, and that's shown in gray here. So when we see the South Arm rising, this corresponds with a rise in salt export from south to north, both through Lakeside and at West Crack. So South Arm comes up, it's pushing water into the north, along with it carrying a bunch of salt. What's super cool also, I think, is that when the South Arm starts to decline, kind of when we enter that evaporation season, that is when we see salt import happening from the north, or we're predicted to. So the way I think about it is South Arm's, water is coming up, it sloshes into the north, then you kind of have this a little bit of lag, or then the South Arm starts to go down, and then you get this sloshing back from the north. And that's where we tend to see these periods of salt import into the South Arm exceeding any amount of salt that's leaving it. So this was our initial attempt, and we shared this with many folks. And when we kind of compared these masses being transferred to what was happening in the South Arm, we came up with some pretty serious inconsistencies. The missing salts, if any of you heard of this, where we were like, we're missing 300 million tons of salt. This is kind of a problem. And so we talk regularly with our colleagues at Utah State, Sam Duda, Brian Crookston, and their grad students. And we collect data, they model, discharge happening at West Crack. And the idea came up of, well, why don't we try to use a more daily discharge data set? This data set is generated using USGS monthly measurements. You can see we're kind of just connecting the dots between those monthly time steps. And just from being out there, being familiar with that site, we know it's very dynamic. It's response to wind, it responds to all kinds of things. So we knew we were not capturing everything happening with this estimate we're showing here. And so Sam Duda and his student Eric Larson were kind of working on this. They were building artificial neural network models to try and predict daily discharge, actually sub-daily discharge at wet crack using wind velocity, wind direction, density differences, water surface elevation, velocities, all kinds of things. And so that is kind of the result of they were amenable to us trying to use their discharge estimates in our salt flux calculations. And those are shown in kind of these dashed lines that have been superimposed on that previous plot. So north to south shown in red and south to north shown in blue. And so as you can see, we were missing a ton of variability. And this daily discharge data set allows us to incorporate a much more dynamic reality that is happening at West Crack. And the result of that is that if we add up the mass that is passed by that site every day from when we can, the period of record from fall of 2017 to July of 2022, we can see that there's two different stories being told depending on the discharge record that we use. So if we use this ANN kind of more variable predicted discharge shown in the solid lines, then we would predict that over this period of time, there's been more salt coming into the south from a north to south flow than from south to north by about 70 million tons. So more salt coming in with that, using that story. If we use the USGS monthly interpolated data, those are shown in dashed lines, you can see that the estimate would be that we would be predicting more salt is leaving the south arm than is coming in by about 260 million tons. And that simply just did not jive with reality. And so an important lesson we learned from this exercise is that we really need daily or sub-daily discharge estimates at West Crack to be able to accurately quantify salt mass exchange happening at that site. And then finally, I kind of just want to integrate all of these things that I've showed you. So this is a cumulative salt flux in millions of tons based, again, just adding up mass that's gone by a site every day for these different kind of sites or different sources. So the West Crack site, so we got north to south in red here, so that's salt mass coming in. So positive values indicate mass that's coming into the south arm. So north to south, West Crack, and then river inflows. The sum total of those over this period of time from fall of 2017 to present is 708 million tons. If we then compare that to that salt that's been going out of the south arm, so West Crack from south to north, and then also at Lakeside, we're now estimating about 667 million tons has gone out. So the net gain in the south arm over that period of time from these sources that we've been able to quantify is 41 million tons. If we compare that to the amount of salt gain in the south arm we've observed from that open water data set, that quantification of mean monthly dissolved salt mass, we predict a gain of about 90 million tons. So that suggests we're missing around 50 million tons, much better than 300 or 400 million tons.
Closer.
Getting closer. So we were encouraged by this, but it's possible, it's possible there's error, obviously, in all of these estimates. And I think that needs to be sorted out of how accurate are the West Crack estimates, how accurate are these other things that could be kind of accounting for this residual. But there's other things going on in the system that we're simply not monitoring and we're not quantifying in our study. These include return flows from mineral extraction ponds. We've observed this in the field. Groundwater, there's been great work from UGS trying to quantify its solute flux from groundwater. There's also something that I don't think we've visited in quite a while, which is salt flux happening through the fill material of the causeway. It's rock-filled causeway. It's 30 kilometers long. What kind of seepage is happening across that causeway that we're not accounting for? And we've done preliminary calculations of pressure head differentials through the water column of comparing south to north, south arm and north arm. And through the majority of the water column, we actually see a pressure head differential that would favor north to south flow. And so the physics are there. It's just a matter of if that causeway can actually allow flow through it. Another thing to consider, which I'm not sure many folks are talking about, is there's a halite salt crust in the Newfoundland Basin, which is west of Great Salt Lake, that was deposited there during the West Desert Pumping Project in the 80s when they were trying to get the lake level down. So there's a ton of salt over there, and there's been some evidence that it's it's decreasing in surface area. Brenda Bowen and her student have kind of documented that. And then it also is kind of migrating toward Great Salt Lake. So there's, and maybe Ellie's familiar with this or others are. So that's another thing to consider. And then also, again, error in our salt flux estimates. So I'll just kind of wrap up by saying, we really targeted this exercise, this analysis to really help inform the process of, or inform our understanding of salt cycling in Great Salt Lake, and try to inform how, working with the Salinity Advisory Committee, providing useful information for them as they make decisions moving forward. So from what we can tell from our analyses, we think the existing salinity monitoring programs are pretty robust for the South Arm. They're doing a decent job. And many of these different data sets are pretty comparable, which is useful. We've clearly demonstrated that the greatest magnitude of salt fluxes are happening at the Causeway Breach, especially at West Crack. And that if we want to get a really accurate estimate of the amount of mass being transferred at that site, daily or sub-daily discharge dynamics matter, either through monitoring or modeling. And also, lastly, there may be other important South Arm salt sources that we were not able to quantify here, but additional monitoring would be needed to confirm that. So with that, I just want to acknowledge everyone who has provided advice, analyses, and data for this, and we're happy to take questions. Thank you.
This is a dumb question, sorry. Could you go back to when you showed the time where the brine layer disappeared and the fluxes of salt?
Yes.
And again, it might be just so simplistic that I just don't get it, right? But I find it really interesting that when the deep brine layer disappears, there's not a responding salt increase in the South Arm.
So there is in the upper brine. So it kind of, so you're talking about here, Anne, where it dives off, and then we see it kind of is all up in the upper brine. There is no.
So it is that little teeny bit of an increase. That's the okay. Yeah, I'm just looking at a different magnitude.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want it to be dramatic.
Could you go to the slider? It was the early one where you had all the salt mass. Yeah. What's the biggest question for me? I don't understand it. In the blue dots, the salt mass in the South Arm. When the culverts were closed, you got a huge decline in that. What's that from?
That took me a while to figure out, but actually that's lakeside. There was still water being conveyed from south to north at that west breach. And so by looking at fluxes at lakeside, we estimate there was about 67 million tons transferred through there. There's kind of a little bit missing there, but I'm pretty confident most of it is exported through lakeside.
Hey, could you go to the map?
The monitor.
The sites, yeah. The site in Carrington Bay is far from being the deepest part of the bay, and we don't have any sites near the causeway where it's the deepest. It's probably meter and a half deeper there.
Yeah.
When you calculate the salt mass in the deep brine layer, how do you account for that deepest part of the bay? Because the salinity increases rapidly, as you go down through past the chemocline.
That's a good point. So you're saying there's a gradient in salinity from here this way, with it being saltier over here, and we're not capturing that.
Right.
Yeah. No, you're right. We wouldn't be capturing that. We do estimate two different salt masses for deep layers in Carrington Bay and Gilbert Bay separately. So whatever we measure, this site we call 2565, we're assuming is representative of this deep layer in Carrington Bay. So we may be an underestimate.
Apply that concentration to
the volume,
the whole volume of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
So
right.
you're missing some salt there.
Yep. We would be.
Wayne, in the work we did, we have a site that's in the deep part.
Yeah.
That's what we use for ours. And we come to the same pattern of salt mass loss and increase as the USGS does, even using that deep site that we have. And And tinkering around with the data, one of the things we found is that despite the brine layer being that salty, volumetrically it's a small amount. And so the big impact it seems to have is conveying salt from the north up into the epilinium through that kind of transient storage that the brine layer is. But because the volume is so small, it's quite dramatic, but it doesn't account for much of the proportional salt mass on a given date. So.
Christine, you got some comments up there, but before, just real quickly on the same note, that boundary is pretty long of the north to the south. And so the diffusive flux might be significant. I mean, you've done first of all, you've done a great job quantifying and bringing this down to be less than 10% of the discrepancy, closer to 5%, right? So that's fantastic. But I do wonder whether a diffusive flux across that boundary may also contribute.
Between, as you move south, kind of.
At the causeway. In other words, it doesn't have to be flow per se.
Yeah, yes,
And
yeah.
so it'd be worth thinking about that possibility.
I agree. I think there's many ways we could refine that kind of estimation of flux there, because the interface is nebulous, and there are many assumptions. The cross-sectional area, whatever we apply for discharge and flux,
And there are pools of very salty water right next to the causeway on the south side. We've been out there on canoe, and it's very salty and very deep.
Yes.
One thing I think I may have mentioned this to you before, and there's another flux that seems to be being ignored is salt dust blowing off of the playas and over to Colorado or into the Wasatch, and that people have looked at this for ocean salt import from the ocean to the mainland. So maybe some of the dust people's data could be used to look at that.
Yeah,
That
that's a cool
salt
idea.
concentration.
That's a cool idea.
And just to follow up, Bill, on the salt flux through the breach, and I had a conversation with Andrew about this. And we recently redeployed some grab samples, some box cores in the deep parts of the south side of the causeway. And we are now convinced that we are retrieving halite from within mud in the south arm. Really? So the question is that from the 60s, or is that kind of contemporaneous with a really salty, cold flux coming through the causeway? But we're now convinced by licking that we've got halite in the south arm. Insights along the very southern edge of the causeway.
Well, in near Promontory Point where they put the causeway in, they built it on top of like 10 meters of thick glauber salt that was accumulated before the causeway time. And I wonder if some of that could dissolve because it's not in equilibrium with the lake water, so it's easy to dissolve it.
Are there any other questions in the room before we move online?
There's some,
Thanks, Blake. So Jaron Andrews asks, were mineral extraction diversions included within the mass balance?
So they were not. We only included things that we could kind of quantify with gauged information. But we have done back of the envelope calculations to consider mineral extraction, diversion, and then kind of return into the south arm. The challenge with that is, we can apply these assumptions. One assumption is that 25% of water withdrawn is returned to the south arm. We can do that calculation. We just don't know how correct that assumption is. And in fact, if we do that calculation, we estimate that 35 million tons, there would be a gain of 35 million tons over that time period I was showing from mineral extraction kind of return flow. I don't know if 25% is accurate. It's not monitored. It's just unclear to me how good those assumptions are. So short answer, no, we didn't include that stuff.
If they're putting more salt back into the lake than they're taking out, they're probably going out of business.
Well, into the south arm.
South arm.
Yeah, so if they're extracting it from the south arm, and I think the compass is the big one where we account for what compass is taking out by that flux from north to south, but they're putting it back in the south arm. It's unclear how much they're putting back.
And then Sarah Null asks, in wet years like this one, does the lake surface stratify with fresh water sitting atop saline water, as this happens with other salt lakes? Do you have any data show this?
Yes. So this is a really fun year for us to watch this. So that's why we kind of referred to this as more of a chemocline, a broader term rather than the deep brine layers. Because in years like this, we do see this kind of, Scott taught me this term, freshet, where you see this freshwater lens happening across the South Arm. And in fact, we've been monitoring salinities at Saltaire every 2 weeks. And for the last couple of weeks, our technician has reported probably a centimeter or two fresh lens on top of the South Arm. So I think the South Arm salinity was maybe 150. That fresh layer was 80 grams per liter. So really, and it's you know, thinking about that across the entire South Arm is really impressive. And then, you know, GSLUB folks are, you know, getting profiles of this, and maybe Branch and Cooperative as well, kind of documenting this gradient. And we can see it at West Crack too, at our site on the causeway. We can see this nice gradient forming in years like this. Yeah.
Tell we're from Great Salt Lake when we refer to 80 grams per liter as fresh.
We're special.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, yeah, recently Madeline Merck and David Tarbon published a paper about salinity in the deep brine layer. So, have you read that? And if you, as they would match up, like one of the things they said was that over the last 40 years, there's been like a 30% decrease in the mass due to the mineral extraction. And so there's a lot of numbers in there that I thought were interesting, challenged some of the things that we thought about. There's a lot of important assumptions in there about, you know, the horizontal homogeneity and the way that they compute the balances and the way that they incorporate the different sites over time. So, and I noticed you use a different, much shorter period.
Yeah.
Anyway, just how is that work informing your work, what you're doing now? And are you going to publish this in a
Yep.
GS?
We're planning. Yep, we're planning to publish this in a journal article. I think the great thing about the Merck and Tarbon paper was that it just put everything into a much longer, multi-decadal time, you know, kind of time frame. Put everything into context, where you can see these fluctuations happening in the 80s, and kind of into the present. I think Scott can talk more about this. He has thoughts on this if he wants to, but some of the numbers that they had, we weren't quite clear with, you know, how they kind of derived. The previous Tarbon papers have, you know, estimated 4.5 billion tons of salt, and I think this one was like 3.6, 3.7. It's kind of unclear how they got that. And so, I mean, general trends, I think, you know, it's good. We're seeing, I love their inverse, you know, south to north. So when South Arm goes down, North Arm goes up, and you can kind of see this mirroring of North and South Arm salt mass over time, which, you know, kind of what we showed as well. And we can, I think generally the trends agreed, but the absolutes were a little bit different. Yeah.
One of the overarching conclusions about that paper is they're looking at it like the whole lake system, North Arm plus South. Right. And they're looking at that much longer time frame and concluding that salt has left the system as a whole. What Christine's talking about here, from my view, is it's the allocation of that salt between North and South. And if you actually look at one of the graphs in the Tarbon paper, it'll show the estimated salt mass in the South Arm. And if you zero in on the years that Christine presented here, you'll see that same drop in 2011 and increase through now. And so they're looking at a bigger, broader sense of it. But when you kind of zoom in on the time period that Christine's talking about, it actually seems to match that part of it.
Awesome. Len, you'll be the last question.
Yeah, I'll be the last one. At what elevation in the South Arm does the lakeside breach suddenly be involved?
I believe it's 4193 is when we start to see south to north flow. But as long as I've been out there since 2014, we haven't really ever observed significant north to south flow. It's really kind of a one-way train from south to north. 4193.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Christine. That was really interesting to hear about. So we'll go ahead and just dive right into Blake's presentation on water right efforts in Great Salt Lake. So whenever you're ready, Blake.
It comes up in this. Okay. And then you bring on the suit. And go what's it? And then you use the crack. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I've got
To my house permission.
We're gonna be
Yep,
special.
you should,
So,
Is it,
you know, in a few years like that.
you do like companion mode, right? Does that affect it?
Log out.
That's funny you asked. I've actually been hired for a job before. Thank you. It's a funny question.
Select it. Yeah, you would think I would know how to do this by now, but apparently not. So, all right. Well, it's an honor to come and present to everyone. And I will say, it's always intimidating to present to a group of academia and technical experts, and especially following Christine's presentation. Just want to prepare everyone emotionally. So this is going from National Geographic to Saturday morning cartoons, maybe Schoolhouse Rock at best. So, I left my title a little bit ambiguous just because when I was approached to present today, wasn't really sure what I was going to present on. But I think there's been a lot of discussions about shepherding, and I think it's important for the state engineer's office to maybe shed some light on what shepherding really looks like and how we do shepherding and what that means, especially as it relates to the Great Salt Lake. But before I do want to take just kind of a little bit of a side trip here. And let me get rid of this. So back a few weeks ago, I made a trip out to the Newfoundland Dike with Eric Dixon from Water Resources. Because for no water rights related issues, more of a personal issue. So this is the spillway at Newfoundland Dike. You can kind of see two structures there on the right-hand side. So on the right is to the west, left is to the east. The right is the spillway, a set of weirs with stop logs in it. My father designed that back in the day. And then on the left is when they're pumping water into the West Desert, they're worried about unexploded ordnance floating back into the Great Salt Lake and detonating on someone's yacht, I guess. I'm not sure. And so the Air Force was very concerned about this and said, we need to put some type of bomb catcher. I'm using air quotes for those of you, I guess you can see my air quotes, bomb catcher in place. And my dad, never missing an opportunity to teach his children how to work, said, hey, I can do this. They wanted to put some type of titanium structure in, and my dad underbid them. And so over school, Christmas vacation one year, me, my 3 other siblings, and my mom went out and installed this bomb catcher. But here's a picture of the actual spillway. You can still see some of the old stop logs in there. There is water actually flowing from the west to the east, so from the west pond into the east pond. So it's kind of a cool picture. I think we found all of Christine's missing salt out there. You can see all the salty crustacean. And then this is a picture of the bomb catcher. So you can see it's kind of the bargain version, which consists of fiberglass slats separated by PVC pipe and rope running through it. And as a child, at about 10 years old, I spent a very cold winter break in sub-freezing brine, pushing this into mud and threading them together. So that's just kind of a personal note. I thought it was kind of a fun-filled trip, and thought you might appreciate it.
So Blake, can I have your autograph?
Out later.
So it held up.
Yeah, this is what I wanted. Like, hey, if you ever go out there, I just want to go out there and see if this thing is still there. And I went out there, and it's still standing, and it's in remarkable good shape. There were no bombs being filtered that I could see, so apparently it scared all the bombs away. So
if someone goes out and collects it,
I don't know. I asked the Air Force guy who's been there this whole time.
Did the little bombs get through?
Yeah, so only little bombs made it through. Only sub 6-inch bombs.
It's about 6 or 8 inches. I'm sure it was based on some specification of the Air Force. Again, I'm 10 years old and this thing is being designed and put in, so I don't really know much of the design specifications the Air Force gave my father, but it was kind of one of those things that I still have PTSD over. And it was at the time I was young. My dad didn't want to spend money on boots that would fit me, so he just had me wear his boots. And obviously those were clumsy, and I fell in the brine several times. So good times. All right.
Wow.
So a few months ago, we had the Stegner conference on Great Salt Lake, and there was a comment made, and I forget who made it. I think it may have been someone from the USGS or someone, but they made this comment that, fortunately, the Great Salt Lake is very simple. It's a model, and that's why I caught mine. I was like, I don't understand. They're obviously talking beyond my capacity to understand. But I think we all know that the Great Salt Lake is not simple, and especially not simple from a hydrologic and water rights perspective. And so this is just like one simple diagram that shows this kind of interconnected web, shows all the sources, all the streams and rivers, not all the streams, the major streams and rivers, and the reservoirs that kind of are upstream of the Great Salt Lake. And as you can see, there's a lot going on. And so when you tug on one thread, there's other threads that kind of follow. And so when we talk about shepherding water to the Great Salt Lake, it's not a very simple conversation, but I'm going to kind of break down how shepherding occurs from the state engineer's perspective, just to maybe shed some light on the principles, because I think there's some misconceptions as to what is needed for shepherding and how we can get water to the Great Salt Lake if that's the desired intent. So what is shepherding? Well, let's talk about shepherding. It relies on the analogy of sheep and other things, right? So we'll start off with the sheep. What's the sheep? Well, it's the water that needs to be delivered to an intended destination. In the context of the conversation we're having, let's call the intended destination the Great Salt Lake. Well, there are also a couple other elements. We have the wolves, who are the intervening diverters who are looking to take the water if they can get it, right? And so you'll notice we got these diversions in the solid blue line, and I kind of have this dashed faded line to represent return flow. So we all know you divert water, you apply it to a field, there's going to be inevitably some return flow to the system that we don't really quantify, we don't really measure. And then, of course, you got the shepherd. In this case, the shepherd is the state engineer or her designee, who delivers the water, the sheet, past the intervening diverters to the intended destination. Like I said, Saturday morning cartoons, so just keep that in mind. So the state engineer does this every day. So when we talk about shepherding, I think there's this mystery, it's kind of enshrouded in mystery a little bit. We simply refer to shepherding as distributing, delivering water to those who are entitled to it and ensuring it doesn't get taken by those who are not entitled to it. And you can see in this picture, those irrigated fields or those municipalities, they have rights and they have water they're authorized, but we want to make sure they're not taking they're not authorized. So water in addition to what they're authorized to take. So there are 3 fundamental elements to effective distribution. I'm going to kind of talk about these elements in turn: measurement, accounting, and adjustment. All right. Let's start off with a little bit of a history lesson. So we all know that the early pioneers arrived in the valley and they built several miles of ditches and canals in order to take advantage of the natural flows from the mountain streams. Many of these streams, actually most of, not all of them, supply water to several different canals or ditches. And so it required them to develop a system that would help apportion that water according to their respective rights. And those rights are kind of based on the sequence in which those ditches or canals were built, or a concept of priority, the first in time, first in right. So what they would do, and this is in a day before we had telemetry and all these other fancy things, is they would meet at the lowest part of a particular stream, they'd gather everyone up, and then they'd walk up the stream. diversion by diversion, and they've measured the flows being diverted into each of these canals or ditches. Okay, so that's the first. So they kind of walk up the stream, measure what everyone is already diverting. And then once they reach the top, the uppermost portion diversion, they added all of those flows. So all the diversions, they added them all together to calculate what we call the available flow. Sometimes this is referred to as natural flow. You'll often hear the data engineer talk about as the natural flow, which is a little bit of, well, it's a very big misnomer, because if you add up all the diversions, it's going to be greater than the total, than the flow at the headwater of the stream, because you're going to have return flows that people downstream are able to then subsequently divert. So you add up all these diversions, which is going to be much more water than what is physically in the stream at the headwaters, okay? And so when they did that accounting, then they kind of figure out, all right, based on your priority and the amount of water you're allowed to take, they would kind of say, all right, this is how much you get, this is how much you get, how much you get. And then they'd walk back down the stream and they would adjust the head gates, or, you know, sometimes these were simple diversions with like sagebrush diversions, just to make sure that each of the canal or ditch were only taking the water that they were authorized to take. So these are kind of the principles that were established and followed in the early days. And this is how the early pioneers handled this. So let's talk about present day. Well, today, most of the major major sources are operated what we call a distribution system. So a distribution system is a special designation that means state engineer has a commissioner on it. The users on the system pay dues and fees to pay for the commissioner, and the commissioner actively regulates. There are rivers that don't have distribution systems on them, but most of the ones where there are multiple different users do have these systems. And they are operated under the supervision of the state engineer. The commissioner, although the commissioners are hired by the distribution system, they are employees of the state and employees of the state engineer. This commissioner's job is to distribute water. Again, distribute is synonymous with shepherd to those who are entitled to it. So how do we do that today? You use the same type of outline measurement. In the state of Utah, if you have a diversion on a stream, you have a water right, you're required to measure your diversion. This is usually accomplished by weirs, flumes, meters. Some of the devices are fitted with telemetry that allows the commissioner just to view what's going on remotely. Accounting, so we have a little bit more, so with all the complexity of the way water is diverted and used, we have more robust accounting systems, but it follows the similar concepts, and the commissioner calculates the natural flow, again, think available flow by adding all the diversions, looking at the priority schedule. A priority schedule is a list of water rights in order of priority. So you have senior water rights at the top, junior water rights at the bottom, and then the commissioner starts allocating flow based on that priority schedule. And sometimes, you know, they'll get to portion of the priority schedule and all the available flow will be allocated, and junior rights will not receive any, or they'll receive less, depending on just what is in the system, what's available in the system. And then, and one thing to keep in mind, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but this is happening all the time, right? This isn't like, hey, we're going to hold the water until this is all done and then we'll send the water down, right? This is happening concurrently with everything else going on. And so as the stream flow changes and the available flow changes, the commissioner needs to adjust the diversions accordingly. On smaller systems, the commissioner actually goes out and adjusts the head gates themselves. Larger systems, the commissioner may rely on a deputy to do that, or even allow the water users to do their own adjustments based on instructions from the commissioner. This is verified by the commissioner, usually using telemetry generally. In some cases, the commissioner can even remotely operate these diversions to adjust them. All right, so this is kind of how we do it present day. I'm going to provide a couple of scenarios. Well, let's start off with, what does this look like? So since this is academia and technical experts, I threw some Greek symbols in there just to make sure it was fitting. So this is the primary accounting equation. And we're going to kind of go down the line and talk about what each of these elements are. So you can see on the left-hand side, the available flow. On the right-hand side are all of the components that contribute to available flow. So first, we all right?
Oh yeah, we're
Okay. The available flow, again, as I've already kind of discussed, represents the amount of water that's available in the system to satisfy existing rights. It also includes any imported water. So one thing that's left off that primary accounting equation is the contribution of imports and exports. I just omitted it for the sake of this discussion, just to keep it simple. But that's something that also that we look at, and that's obviously very important as it relates to, imports from the Weaver River to the Provo River, or imports from the Colorado River Basin into the Utah Lake Jordan River drainage. Diversions, again, similarly, we just look at the sum of all the diversions on the systems, the canals, ditches, and pumps. You can see I've added a little measurement icon or meter icon to all of these points of diversion, because that is what is required. They are required to measure their diversions. And again, you have those return flow paths, which are not measured, but we understand they are occurring back to the system. Then we have change in storage, so delta storage, right? So water is delivered to reservoirs in a similar fashion as to any other right. They have a priority date. They're able to take water when they're available in priority and store that water. But they can also release water without respect to the priority date. So if they have a big storage pool, they can deliver that water out of priority because they've diverted it and stored it in priority. Okay. So it can go up, it can go down. You have evaporated losses. Reservoirs obviously suffer from evaporation, so that's something the state attorney needs to take into account just to make sure the accounting equation is balanced. And we also have conveyance losses. This is typically associated with deliveries from storage. These are generally based on either studies or some assumptions, or even in some cases, a court has decreed what the conveyance loss is without regard to whether that's actual correct or not. But these are typically assigned to releases from storage. So they might release a certain block, and at the head gate, they may receive a reduced amount, and the delta between those is that conveyance loss component. And then we have this final one, in-stream outflow. This represents the amount of water leaving the system at the bottom of it, okay? Whether that's incidental, accidental, or intentional, or it's water being delivered to a terminal user. In this case, we'll say the Bird Refuge, WMA, or the Great Salt Lake. So traditionally, the Bird Refuges, duck clubs, they've been the terminal user. But now with the current efforts, we've moved one user to the right on the diagram a little bit. And so we'll talk a little bit some of the implications that has with regard to how we measure that outflow. So I have two examples that just to and they are very simple, and just we all recognize that the saying that all models are wrong, some are useful. This falls into that category. It's going to be a very simplistic approach. So in this example, we're going to look at something where all the rights are satisfied. And so we have the available flow, and that's equal to the sum of diversions. You can see I've thrown a couple users up here with their priority dates. The storage delivery does not have a priority date because that can be delivered based on what storage is available. These are the diversions, and we would capture those. So essentially we have 60 CFS worth of diversions. We have a change in storage. So the storage reservoir has its own priority date in which it can divert. So what this means is, even though that storage reservoir is delivering that 10 CFS, it's still increasing by 40 CFS. And we can recognize that we measure storage in acre feet, maybe not CFS, but I just wanted to keep the units the same just for ease of calculation purposes. We have evaporation coming off the reservoir. We have 5 CFS loss. So for that delivery storage, they're sending 15 CFS. The head gate, they're getting 10. We recognize that the 5 CFS is lost by a conveyance in a very simplistic approach. And then we have the in-stream outflow at 20 CFS with a priority date of 1928 for no other for a reason that is specific. Let's say that's the bird refuge, right? They have a 1928 priority date on the Bear River. That's why it's that date. So you add those up together, you get 130 CFS, and all rights are satisfied. There is no controversy. The state engineer is delivering this water. Now that 130 CFS is likely a lot more water than what is actually in the stream at the top of the system, right? Because it's being diverted, it's coming back. That water that's returning back to the system is available for diversion further on down the system. And so there's a lot of questions I think we get, like, why aren't we measuring at each segment of the stream? Well, using this accounting equation, we can account for that return flow because it's essentially a mass balance equation, right? It's inflow equals outflow plus change in storage at its most fundamental. So let's talk about an example where rights are not all satisfied. So we have this scenario is going to have a curtailment of junior rights. We have the available flow, we have diversions. And again, it's counterintuitive because we're already saying, hey, these rights, we're curtailing them and we don't even know what the available flow is. Remember, this is happening continuously. These adjustments are being made. And so this accounting is how we account for the adjustments that would need to be made in real time. So in this case, just because I know what the answer is going to be at the end of the equation, we know we're going to have to curtail some of the junior rights to satisfy the senior rights. So we have a junior right upstream of the 1930 priority date. We have the senior rights downstream at 1875. And so we know that we've got to satisfy senior rights first. Delivery from storage continues to happen. And in this case, the 1950 priority. The 1950 priority date for the storage reservoir is out of priority, right? It's junior, so it's not taking water, but it's also delivering water. And you wonder, well, where's the negative 20 CFS coming from? Well, remember, we still got the evaporation component, and we're still delivering 10 CFS, and we're actually delivering 15 CFS, 5 of which is associated with the conveyance loss. So that's why we have a negative storage component of 20 CFS. And then downstream 1928, they beat the 1930 priority date. They're still satisfied at 20 CFS. And so you can see we add all the elements together and we get an available flow of 60 feet CFS. And this is how the state engineer operates these distribution systems in matter of accounting for it, measuring, accounting, and adjustment. And the reason I wanted to make this very simple is because without any change applications, without any other elements, essentially the state engineer is shepherding water to the senior rights on the system just by virtue of distributing water in priority. And so I wanted to try to hammer home that shepherding is nothing more than distribution, and the state engineer does this every day. So in this case, the state engineer has shepherded the 50 CFS past junior diverters to those who are entitled to it. And so when we look in the context of the Great Salt Lake and maybe potentially moving water to the Great Salt Lake based on a change application, it's really no different. I thought about having a scenario where we went through a change application, but it's not much different. It's simply, hey, we're going to take this block of water that was once available further upstream, we're going to assign that priority date downstream and move it there and account for it that way. There are some nuances to that. Obviously, these intervening diverters benefit from return flows. So when we look at what water is available to actually move, we can't impact those existing rights. And so we would probably only look at the depletive portion, moving that to the Great Salt Lake. So summary, shepherding is distribution. We do this every day, all day. It's nothing new to us. It's something that we use the diversions that are already required by law in order, and the accounting measurements to make it happen and then make any adjustments necessary. So when we look at distribution, it requires accurate measurement. We work with water users on distribution systems to make sure that they're measuring devices are maintained and they're accurate. We making a big push to increase the amount of telemetry we have so that we have a more robust database full of diversion data. And part of this will be, with some of the funding we recently received from the legislature, we're looking at doing a gap analysis in the Great Salt Lake Basin to identify where we may need more enhanced measurement, enhanced telemetry. And I think part of that gap analysis will include the needs of other agencies beyond the state engineer's office. Obviously, you can, the needs for USGS or DWR are probably different. There may be some overlap, or maybe a sweet spot in the Venn diagram, but I think our gap analysis that we're anticipating collaborating with Utah State University conducting will help identify where these gaps exist and maybe develop a prioritized list of those potential telemetry or measurement devices, and then we can allocate funding to kind of help fill those gaps is the hope. Accounting, we develop and maintain various accounting models. We call them WCAT for Surface Water Commissioner Accounting Tools. You can kind of see a screenshot from the one we have on the Provo River with the teacup diagrams of Jordanelle and Deer Creek. And then we also have been developing a groundwater commissioner accounting tool for areas that have groundwater management plans where we're actively ensuring that they're not exceeding depletions and exceeding safe yield. And we continue to develop these. These are public facing. You should be able to go on our website and look at them. I just warn you, they are not incredibly intuitive. We are trying to make them more intuitive so that we feel like knowledge is power, and the more transparent they are, the more it empowers everyone to make wise decisions and understand how water is being delivered. The bin adjustment, as we already talked about, state engineer has, in the state, we have 36 commissioners who administer 42 separate distribution systems. 14 of those commissioners are within the Great Salt Lake Basin. They have 13 deputies. And so we're actively out there adjusting head gates, monitoring diversions, making sure people are not, or water users are not using more water than they are authorized. And so that when, for instance, Great Salt Lake Trust wants to acquire water and deliver it to the Great Salt Lake, we have an understanding of how that can happen. And we have the person boots on the ground who helps us understand the actual mechanics of making that happen as well. I talked a little bit about some of the challenges with kind of the more recent developments about getting water to the Great Salt Lake. I think we all know historically, we've typically relied on some of these terminal gauges, whether it's the Corinne gauge or the gauge at Plain City or and the one on the Jordan River at the Surplus Canal, and just said the duck clubs and the bird refuges, that's their point of diversion. Now what we're understanding is, well, there may be a desire to understand what's getting past those into the Great Salt Lake, especially as we talk about salinity in the South Arm, and making sure if the Great Salt Lake Trust wants to move water for purposes of nothing more than salinity, we want to make sure, well, that water is getting past these refugees, WMAs, into the intended destination. This will require some additional measurement and telemetry. So I think that's kind of the big gap that we've identified, and we have been working collaboratively with the bird refuge and with the wildlife resources to identify how we can best do this. Unfortunately, it's complex. These are complex systems. There's not one single point of entry into the Great Salt Lake through these clubs or the bird refuge and those types of things. So we're trying to develop approaches that make sense, that give us some assurance that water is getting past that into the Great Salt Lake. I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So happy to entertain any questions.
Thanks for the nice presentation. I'm curious to understand how well your office understands the degree to which all of those wetland areas on the east side of the lake are sustained by groundwater inflow versus surface water inflow. Is that something that's well understood and quantified at this point, or is it not clear?
Yeah, I from our agency's perspective, it is not well. I guess there isn't a great emphasis on it, unless there are groundwater rights associated with that. Even then, we haven't traditionally managed surface and groundwater conjunctively. There's certain areas where we have, and it's a nightmare, just to be candid.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, the communication between surface and groundwater sometimes is not well understood. So,
But it's real.
it's real. It is real. It's real. And so the question is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Like, so where we have done it is because we know that there's some communication and that we need to turn off this pump because there will have a direct impact on a surface diverter. In the perfect world, we'd understand the lag time, and we'd understand, hey, because most groundwater rights are junior in priority, right? Just by virtue of they came in later. And so we recognize that this is problematic, that more people are seeking to move their surface water to groundwater because it's a more reliable supply, but that does have impacts on the available surface supply. And so this is a big issue. We're trying to do better at understanding. We are certainly looking towards some of these studies with regard to groundwater and their contributions to the Great Salt Lake. We've certainly partnered with USGS and UGS and other entities that understand groundwater. But trying to put that information into a conjunctive management has been challenging. Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks.
In your last line, you say there's 36 commissioners in the Great Salt Lake Basin. How's the interaction between Idaho and Wyoming and the exchange of data? Or are those 36 commissioners across all three states?
No. So these are only the 36 commissioners for the state of Utah. We have 14 in the Great Salt Lake Basin. So as it relates to the Bear River Basin, we're kind of focusing on there. We have a commissioner on the Lower Bear, on the Little Bear, and in the Logan River. We actively participate in an interstate commission with Idaho and Wyoming on the Bear River. The diversion and apportionment of the Bear River is dictated by that compact, our compact obligations. And so we continually work with the commission, the other states, and Pacific Corps. Pacific Corps kind of manages the Bear River for all intents and purposes, right? And so we are in active communication on a weekly basis with Idaho, primarily Idaho, because they're the ones taking water from Bear Lake before it gets to Utah. And they have their accounting model, we have our accounting model, and then Pacific Corps has their accounting model. And we kind of talk and make sure our models are kind of all saying the same thing. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is how do you account for the storage from Bear Lake? Pacific Corps has an obligation to deliver stored water to users in Idaho and Utah. And so when the natural flow, air quotes, or the natural flow that does not include the storage component, when that's unable to satisfy the rights, it's, Pacific Corps will turn on their pumps, and then that starts eating into, they kind of have this storage bank account in Bear Lake. Some of these users do. And then they say you start getting charged storage from Bear Lake. So to answer your question, we are actively collaborating with Idaho and the commission and Pacific Corps to make sure these all balance out. And then on the Upper Bear, obviously there's some compact constraints with regard to the elevation of Bear Lake and whether some users can have upstream storage. But again, those are spelled out in the compact. So long answer. Did I get the question? And
I'm kind of really interested in the two presentations that we had today, and if you had any response to not knowing or not being able to know the numbers from the mineral companies taking their water rights taken out in your mass balance, not knowing what they take out. And I understand that you don't measure return flow, so that totally makes sense, but you don't have numbers on how much they take out either, right?
So I'm going to reject the premise. We do know how much water they divert. We do. Yeah, they report that to us every year, and it's available for the public to see.
So, and the difference is brine versus salt. Christine's talking about salt.
Yeah, we know how much water they physically divert.
But you don't have much salt is in the water. Okay, so I was trying to put the two together.
Yeah, and to answer one, we don't know what the return flow contribution is.
Right,
to the Great
I
Salt
understood
Lake,
that.
But we do know what they divert, because they are obligated to report that to us.
But not
Sorry.
the brine, just the water. Okay, thank you.
Christy, I apologize. You guys found that.
It's valid.
Thank you. No, again, that's really helpful.
So, I mean, I could see a gap. Okay, so if I understand correctly, that in-stream outflow is now Great Salt Lake, new paradigm. There's data gaps at the bottom of the system to ensure delivery. That comes from a gap analysis. I'm curious if you guys are talking about gap analysis for physical infrastructure, say conveyance. Are there conveyances missing that could be inserted at the lower end of the system, which would fill a data gap and a physical infrastructure gap? And of course, I'm thinking that the Army Corps is about to ride in on their horses and save the day.
So you mean like the construction of is at the bottom of this scenario, you have a demand for 30 CFS for that right. And because it's depletion, we're shepherding the depletion. You know, it's going to be water that was consumed in priority. Now, this is under a scenario where all rights are satisfied. Obviously, if that junior priority right was in it was a time of year when it was curtailed, it'd be a different story. We'd only be able to deliver what water would have been available to that diverter under its underlying priority date. So a lot of jargon there. Did I lose anyone?
We don't want that water.
I wonder if you could.
You want the senior, you want the 1847 or whatever,
I
right?
wonder if you could go to the scenario where all water rights are not satisfied.
Yeah.
Some are
Let's talk this one.
failed,
Yeah.
and
Doesn't change much. So now we're gonna file a change on that same water right. They're only authorized to get 10 CFS under this curtailment scenario. So we're only gonna allow 5. We're only gonna deliver 5 in this during the time of year. So this is the same water right, just maybe in August instead of April or May, right? And so they've already moved it. It's already down the bottom of the system. But hey, based on your priority, you really only should be able to demand 5 CFS. That's the depletive portion of your water. Again, these are round numbers, very simplistic scenario. One thing I also want to point out is that we have these intervening reservoirs. So if you file change application on something in Heber Valley, water does not just spill out of Utah Lake, right? Maybe it will this year, but usually it doesn't. It's got to be pumped out. And so there are other complications that, hey, if I want my water to move through that reservoir, it's probably going to be assessed some evaporative loss, and you probably have to have an agreement with the Utah Lake Water Users Association, and you have to pay them in order to pump that water into the Jordan River for their delivery downstream. So again, just one little wrinkle in, and this is a very wrinkled blanket, I'm afraid. So,
and one question about the change applications. I'm hearing that that's the way forward here, like that.
Yeah,
that could make a big impact.
Yeah.
The more
without a change
water, right?
application, people would just be able to take that. If still, if today this guy decided to file his bills without a change application, that's just free chicken to everyone downstream, right? Because they have a right to take whatever water's in the system. Without that change application, coloring that water and telling the state engineer to shepherd that water, it probably won't make it to the Great Salt Lake.
And are people doing this? Like, have you seen people come forward and?
Well, yeah, we've been doing this actually with Wildlife Resources, Audubon, TNC, on the Jordan River. We've done this, not necessarily, they've kind of said that WMA is the intended destination. So prior to this last legislative session, or 2 legislative sessions ago, I guess. So now we can send water to the Great Salt Lake, and it can be beneficial use in the sovereign, in the body of the Great Salt Lake, as long as Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is a signatory to the change application. We didn't used to have that option. So what Audubon and TNC have been doing is partnering with people who have water rights on Jordan River, filing a change with Wildlife Resources, saying we want this water delivered to the WMA, and by virtue of it with the WMA, it's going to get into Great Salt Lake. Yeah, so people have done it. We're expecting more of it, but it's primarily been on the Jordan River thus far.
We're just about out of time. It's 10:30. Sorry, Wayne, unless it was like a quick one.
I'll
Then
get
we
them afterwards.
cut you
All right.
off. Awesome. Thanks so much, Blake. It was really awesome to hear that in this setting. Appreciate you giving us a sciencey water rights talk. So if anyone has any super important things to share with the group, feel free. If not, Lynn, go ahead.
The 2024 Great Salt Lake Issues Forum will be May 8th, 9th, and 10th. Okay.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Our next tech team meeting will be September 12th in this exact room. And by then I'll be able to report on which tech team grants we've awarded. And we'll have some more interesting presentations for you all. So
One
yes.
more little announcement, the International Society for Salt Lake Research meeting is also in 2004. I haven't exactly in Turkey. So, in October or November. They're working on it.
Thanks all for coming. If you haven't signed this sheet yet, feel free to come on down and hopefully see some of you tomorrow at the advisory council. Thanks so much.